Okay, I'm just going to get us started. Thank you for joining us today to discuss IBO's recently released analysis of New York City's executive budget for fiscal year 2025. This also includes our independent economic and spending forecast and an update to our estimates on asylum seeker costs. I'm Taina Guarda, IBO's Chief Outreach and Engagement Officer. We'll be answering questions for about 45 minutes today. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions ahead of time, but also feel free to add new questions to the Q&A box, and I'll try to fit them in. Anything that I don't, I promise I will get back to you. This virtual event is being held on Zoom meetings, which has some accessible features. Automated live captions are available by turning on closed captioning at the bottom of your screen. And I'm going to hand it off to our advisory board member, Wayne Ho, the president and CEO of the Chinese American Planning Council.
Great. Thank you very much. Good morning. Good to see everyone and our allies that are here. As was mentioned, I'm Wayne Ho, and I'm the president and CEO of the Chinese American Planning Council, which is the nation's largest Asian American social services nonprofit. And I'm also honored to be an advisory board member to the IBO. So just from the wonky perspective, the IBO does have an advisory board that's built into the city charter, and they have defined positions and background on each role. So I'm the nonprofit member of the advisory board. And as part of the leadership at the IBO, the new leadership at the IBO over the last year, there's been an effort to make sure the IBO works with not just legislators, who are often the ones asking for reports from the IBO, but that the IBO has been much more assertive in trying to get its information out there. And of course, then nonprofit organizations, advocates, as well as social services providers become very key audience for us. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Part of this briefing is to give you a sense of what's going on, the latest reports from the IBO, but also is we want to let you all know what the IBO does provide to the city to carry out our mission of enhancing the understanding of New York City's public policy and economy through the work that the IBO does. And there's opportunities for not just legislators, but for other New Yorkers to approach the IBO to not just run their core reports, but also specific reports. And you're going to hear more about that today. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce someone who's no stranger to the sector, someone who's been working not only in the nonprofit side, but also in the governmental side throughout her career. So the director of the IBO, Louisa Chafee.
Thank you, Wayne. And good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to host you here today. So our objective is to talk, as Wayne said, about the two reports we published last Wednesday, May 15th. One is directly in response to our charter mandate, an update or the IBO's response to the administration's executive budget, and the other is the update of our asylum seeker reports. And here today, I have the two senior research and strategy officers to speak in detail. I'm going to give the top line headline and then hand it over to Sarah and Sarita to go through the interesting and critical further information. In the $116 billion and $113 billion budgets proposed by the administration for the current and next year, or the revisions, there is a surplus according to the administration this year, and there is a surplus according to the administration next year. The IBO believes there is a larger surplus than what the administration has identified. And so we see that for the next 2 years, the city is in very easy, sound fiscal shape with up to $5 billion or more surplus with the ability to roll that over or deploy as needed. So now I'm going to hand it to Sarah to talk in depth about the analysis of the 2025 executive budget. Sarah?
Hello, good morning. As Louisa mentioned, IBO looks at the city's budget as presented by the mayoral administration, and we look at both revenues of taxes coming in, so how much money does the city bring in and therefore have to spend, and then we also look at spendings. So this is places where we analyze city agency budgets and see if there are programs we think will cost more or less, if there's savings or additional funding needed. In those agencies, we call those repricings. And when we put together both our revenue estimate and our spending estimates, we land with what IBO thinks the city's budget either surplus or gap is going to be across the financial plan. So for the period 2024, our current fiscal year, which is winding down, it ends in June, through fiscal year 2028. For the current year, IBO estimates slightly more tax revenue than the administration, but notably lower spending for this year. And this leads to a surplus, an additional surplus of 1.1 billion. Now this, I say additional because the administration is already projecting a surplus of around 4 billion this year. So IBO sees an additional area where we have funding. This is IBO's estimate is a $5.1 billion surplus for this year. If that surplus gets rolled into next year, we use it to prepay expenses so that the city maintains its balanced budget by law. We anticipate that we will have about a $1.1 billion surplus again next year. I'm going to get into some of the where this money comes from, where we found this money in a little bit. IBO is predicting larger gaps starting in 2026 through 2028, so sort of the back end of the financial plan. Larger gaps than the administration, largely due to programs that have not been fully budgeted for these further out years. There's some notable places, again, I will cover sort of highlights, where the city budgets funding for the near term, but does not have money in the plan for the future term, for the further out years. And this creates a place where there's a lot of budget uncertainty. In general, the city economy is doing well. We are adding jobs. Nationally, the country is back to well above pre-pandemic levels. New York City is just hitting employment levels roughly about where we were before the pandemic hit. So we're still playing catch up compared to the country, but we're adding jobs, and tax revenues are coming in quite steadily. On the spending side, nearly 800 million of IBO's $1 billion estimate for savings, which is driving most of our surplus this year, stems from lower citywide staffing. So this is a place where the city has almost $55 billion budgeted for personnel costs. And we looked at the payrolls to date, and the city has not been spending as much as they have budgeted. So we have 4 pay periods left to the city fiscal year, and based on that, IBO sees about very, very sort of cautiously around $800 million in savings. Now, this would be positions that were budgeted but never got filled, or that took longer to fill than anticipated. But this is one of the more notable areas of savings, and also one of the more predictable areas, given that the fiscal year is winding down. Another very notable area of repricing, IBO has looked at the cost of asylum seekers and estimates almost 3.2 billion. This is 3 billion in city funds, less spending than what the administration is presenting for 2025 and 2026. Sarita will be covering that more in depth shortly. Areas of higher spending, as I mentioned, there are places where the city's budget doesn't fully seem to include funding that we would expect it to eventually have to incur. IBO estimates that we need 605 million all city funds next year for personnel costs, particularly around overtime in the police, sanitation, and Department of Correction. We also estimate 651 million will be needed from 2025 through 2027 to fund current levels of the city FHEP's housing rental voucher program. Our estimates do not include the potential expansion of the program, which is certainly would increase costs beyond what we anticipate. And then certainly an area that many have been talking about. In the Department of Education, there are ongoing programs that have been funded with COVID relief aid, but that is now going to expire. And so the city would have to self-fund using city dollars these programs to continue them. And we have a detailed chart on that in our report. Finally, one of the things that has been really a hallmark of this budget cycle, this planning period in the administration, has been the program to eliminate the gap, PEG budget reductions. There were 5% agency reductions called for in November, and then an additional 5% called for in January. While the administration called off what had been previously announced a final 5% cut with this budget, there have been a lot of budgetary reductions over the course of planning this fiscal year. The executive budget restored some of these previous cuts, including 2 police officer academies for the spring and fall of this year, funding for cultural institutions, and funding for some programs serving justice-involved individuals. However, previous cuts across many areas, particularly just to highlight some, libraries, older adult centers, early childhood programs, have remained in place. And certainly this is an area that we expect City Council and the mayor to have many discussions on as they lead up to adopting the budget at the end of June. So with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Sarita.
Thank you, Sarah. The second report that we published last Wednesday included an update to our asylum seeker cost projections. And so, as Sarah mentioned, those models factored into our gap estimate. Following other models that we have published, IBO looked at 3 potential scenarios, recognizing that this is a very fluid situation and there are a lot of uncertainties around projections for this population. Notably, in this most recent update, IBO also included an analysis of potential negative consequences as a result of the exit policies that the administration has instituted. Through the program to eliminate the gap, or PEG, as Sarah mentioned, the administration has presented these exit policies as pure cost savers in an effort to reduce the population. However, IBO identified some key areas for which we were able to use a data-driven approach to estimate the potential negative consequences, particularly around the overall economic impact of missing work authorizations, the additional healthcare costs related to street homelessness, and also the increased transportation costs for school children who are forced to exit, who might continue to attend the same school and therefore might incur additional transportation costs. So first, I'd like to review the differences between IBO's 3 cost scenarios compared with the administration's. I will note that all 3 of IBO's cost scenarios produce lower costs compared with the administration. In our higher cost scenario, IBO projects a growth of the population for 2025 and a constant population in 2026. The difference between our estimate and that of the administration is that we estimate a more modest growth in 2025, largely due to the fact that we do not project an increase in the population during the summer, similar to what it was experienced last summer. And that's driven by the fact that we've been speaking with providers on the ground who reported that growth last summer began in the late spring, and that level of growth has not yet been seen this year. And so IBO projects slower growth in 2025 compared with the administration. IBO's middle cost scenario, which is the scenario that is factored into our executive budget gap analysis that Sarah mentioned. So that was the $3 billion savings in city funds for 25 and 26. And that scenario factors in a reduction of the adult population due to the exit requirements. And then finally, our lower cost scenario additionally factors in a more modest reduction to the family population due to the exit requirements. As I mentioned, a key addition to this analysis was the identification of some negative consequences to asylum seekers due to the exit requirements. I'm going to briefly touch upon, the methodology that IBO used to produce these estimates. So first, in terms of the economic impact of missed work authorizations, IBO use data produced by Department of Labor study. The Department of Labor surveyed businesses that in New York City that identified jobs that they would fill with asylum seekers. And so this is specific to New York City and to particular sectors that would be filled by asylum seekers. These are largely minimum wage paying jobs and in the sectors of accommodation, food services, healthcare, and social assistance sectors. So to produce this estimate, IBO used potential earnings of minimum wage at full-time employment, and then also factoring in the ripple effects on the economy for income that asylum seekers would incur that they would then spend in the local economy using a multiplier. So in total, IBO estimates the opportunity cost of not getting work authorization could mean up to $1 billion in a year. Another area that IBO estimated an impact would be for healthcare impacts associated with street homelessness. For this, IBO model did extensive research of existing studies in this area, recognizing that there really are not any direct comparable circumstances for IBO to draw from. However, we did identify a study in Boston that looked specifically at the difference in healthcare costs between a sheltered population and a street homeless population. And so based on an estimate of the number of individuals that have received exit notices, IBO assumed that about 1 in 4 of those individuals might experience street homelessness as a result of the exit requirements. And so we estimate that that could have an impact of up to $870 million in a year. And then finally, students who are forced to exit shelter by federal law are allowed to attend the same school. Presumably, it's possible that the shelter that they would be relocated to might be farther. And so therefore, IBO came up with an estimate of additional costs to bus students from the new shelter location to their current school. This was based off of data that we were able to obtain from our city partners and city council that shared the number of new busing requests that were made by students in the first 2 months of this calendar year. we sort of annualized the number of requests, recognizing that that's while school is out over the summer, if students were moved, then we would anticipate those requests to be submitted at the beginning of the school year in the fall. So we multiplied the 2-month estimate by 6 to get an annual estimate, and then multiplied that by the per student cost to bus students. And so we arrive at an estimate of up to $30 million. I do want to note that for all 3 of these potential negative consequences, IBO recognizes that these are costs that may be borne by the individuals, the asylum seekers themselves, or to the larger New York City community, and they're not necessarily borne by government entities in the same way as our other cost projections are estimated. And so this could be impacting individuals, government, businesses, nonprofits, some or none of which may be reimbursed by the government. And I think that covers our asylum seeker estimate. I'm going to turn it back over to Tina.
Thank you, Sarita. And we got a question that I feel like we've addressed a couple of times before about whether IBO factored in the common practice of new arrivals remitting earned funds home rather than spending in the local economy.
Yes, that is an excellent question. We do note in our methodology, we looked at other studies that have found that about 15% of earnings are remitted back to the home country. Because we were looking at the impact of the exit requirements on the immediate first year, and given that asylum seekers are forced to exit, will need to find housing, we opted to not adjust our estimate downward for remittances for that first year, because we assume that a lot of upfront costs will be needed to be covered. That does not suggest that they would not be sending funds home in the future. But we, because of the large upfront costs, we opted not to adjust for those remittances in the first year.
And there was also a question sort of clarifying what the basis of 1 in 4 single adults possibly ending of new arrivals ending up unsheltered.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. We recognize that there's a lot of informal housing that people can avail of, and so that's why we estimate about 3 out of 4 individuals would be able to find alternate forms of housing. We took a conservative approach of 1 in 4, recognizing that the city does not track asylum seekers once they exit the system. So in the absence of knowing exactly where and how many asylum seekers are leaving the system and where they're going, IBO had to come up with an assumption of what share of those individuals might be affected by street homelessness.
And there was a request to review the lower cost scenario one more time.
Sure. So the lower cost scenario factors in a reduction of the adult population due to the exit requirements, as well as a more modest reduction of the family population, largely recognizing that the families are required to exit, but are provided alternate shelter placements. And so the reduction assumed for families is much smaller than what is factored in for adults.
Thank you, Sarita. I'm going to go with some of the questions that we've gotten previously, and one that came in a couple of times is what the impact of budget cuts to the Mayor's Office of Contract Services, what the impact of those cuts could be, specifically around budget cuts for Passport, the technology side of actually being able to process contracts are.
Hi, this is Louisa, so I'm going to take that. So the IBO has been studying PEGs throughout this year, both within city agencies and within entities under contract to the city or doing business with the city. So one of the fundamental systems across the entire procurement is Passport. And as the Mayor's Office of Contract Services has had PEGs both a reduction in their headcount and a reduction in the monies to administer their system, we are quite concerned that this will further slow the procurement process. There's a timing issue because the way we get data is a little bit after the fact, but we have been in conversations with the Mayor's Office of Contract Services and with other agencies in the city that greatly use the Passport system, both within the not-for-profit world and the larger world. And we feel that this is a topic that warrants strong attention. I think it's worth saying that any IT system will have challenges or will probably have challenges, and that the alternate to the current system would be paper, which could be mind-blowingly inefficient. And this for an administration that is already struggling with timely registration and payments. So whether one is a human service provider or a construction vendor, these cuts impact across the city, and we're paying attention.
Thanks, Louisa. And just so everyone knows, I know this is a diverse group of people here, so I'm going to focus on questions by topic. And next up, I'll be asking some education questions that come in, followed by environment, and then arts funding, and then some miscellaneous programmatic questions. So I just want to let you know what that agenda looks like, given the diversity of issues we're going to be addressing today. So for education, Sarita, I'm going to be asking you a couple of things. What are the projected cuts to school budgets through fair student funding?
Thank you. Yes. So this current year in fiscal 24, the city did include 160 million in federal stimulus funds to hold school budgets harmless. And this was the second such year that the administration did this. And that 160 million funded roughly more than 1,700 pedagogical positions, as I mentioned last year and this year. Now, without the federal stimulus funds, schools, in the next couple of weeks, will be receiving their preliminary budgets, for the next school year. And so that's something that IBO will be monitoring in terms of what the impact might be to school budgets, but we do not have information on school budgets yet.
And Sarita, what are the effects of vacancy reductions and hiring freezes? And where are we with the contracting a teaching force, especially given class size?
Yeah, so at the city council hearing on the 15th, this was the education budget hearing. The DOE shared that the projected reduction in the workforce are positions that are funded by the federal stimulus funds, as I just mentioned. There was also mention of a potential add of $180 million to school budgets next year, with that largely to address the class size reduction efforts. And so the DOE estimates that will allow for the hiring of between 1,200 and 2,000 teachers. And so that's something that, IBO will be looking to see that $180 million adjustment in the adopted budget.
And is there anything IBO wants to say about the lack of transparency in the school capital plan? I smile because I used to I used to analyze the school capital plan, but yeah, if you could answer that, Sarita, too.
Yeah, so IBO has always spoken in favor of greater transparency, and this is an area that we do acknowledge and did notice that in this particular in the 2025 to 2029 SEA capital plan, we noted that for new capacity projects that were unsited, so those that did not have a site identified yet, previously the School Construction Authority would at least identify the district in which those seats would be allocated. In this plan, there is no such identification at the district level. So that is something that we plan to follow up with. We've already started engagement with the School Construction Authority to better understand the planning for those seats.
There's also a question on funding for arts, culture, and arts and culture education specifically. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yes, so we do note that some of the stimulus funds were used for arts funding, and so we estimate a shortfall of 41 million for arts funding in 2026 and beyond. This is part of our larger repricing around programs that were previously funded with the federal stimulus dollars. In the executive plan, the administration did add 41 million of additional city funds for 2025. However, those funds were not added for the out years, which is why IBO does re-estimate the need for those funds.
There's a similar question looking into the funding and what was restored and what's been actually funded around community schools. And where perhaps there's programming that the administration is funding for because they're saying that that's enough for that programming, but that before it had been funded for more.
Yeah, so community schools is also an area that we have continually re-estimated based on the amount of federal stimulus funds that the DOE, the Department of Education, has allocated for those programs. So in terms of community schools, the DOE shared with IBO that for this current fiscal year, 50 million of federal stimulus funds went towards community schools. And in the executive budget, the administration added 48 million of state funds. So this is part of the increase from foundation aid that was used to address the federal aid shortfall in 2025 and each out year. Additionally, the administration restored the former cut or program to eliminate the gap for community schools, again using the state foundation aid, and that is for 8 million in 2025 and beyond.
And can you go into what the total amount spent on summer rising during fiscal year 2025 is?
So yeah, so I'm gonna focus on sort of the holes in funding for summer rising, in particular across both Department of Education and Department of Youth and Community Development. So because it's a program that is funded out of both agency budgets. Back at the November plan, there was a cut to the DYCD budget of 20 million for summarizing, and at the preliminary budget, 80 million in city funds was added to the Department of Education budget, and at the time, we had heard directly from DYCD that add in the Department of Education budget was intended to cover some of the cut in the DYCD budget. However, this is an area that IBO is still monitoring, as an add to the Department of Education budget is for DOE specific programs. So the programs that are operated by and funded by DOE and DYCD are separate. And so we didn't necessarily see that as a restoration of the DYCD cut. Rather, we recognize the $80 million additional city funds as plugging the hole for previously funded federal COVID aid programs. So the DOE had previously funded summarizing with federal COVID aid. And so IBO saw this as a one-time plug for 2025. However, we estimate that an additional 80 million in the DOE budget will be needed in 2026 and beyond. And then we believe there is additional funds in the DYCD budget that may need to be covered to cover that cut.
And there's a recent question that came in that might be, I'm not sure that you can speak to it right away, but might be something that we could follow up on whether there's a plan for funding student success centers.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I can certainly follow up.
Okay, yeah. And another question too was, we heard about the 2 billion in addition to the school capital plan, and whether we know of when we might see that that money actually being planned for.
Yeah, that's a good question. We do note this in our executive budget report that there was in the increase to the statutory limit on the number on the amount that could be issued by the Transitional Finance Authority. There was language in the state budget to for the city to increase planned expenditures of 2 billion for school construction. That's something that we will continue to monitor. But we have that, that was just passed in the state budget, and so we haven't yet seen that reflected in city documents.
Okay. Thanks. And I'm going to move on to some questions that came in on environment-related legislation. So I'm going to ask those to Sarah. Hi, Sarah.
Hello.
I was wondering if you can tell us about changes to DCAS's capital budget, specifically in relationship to Local Law 97. And there's a question of whether raising the city's debt ceiling limit has any impact on its funding, on the funding for Local Law 97.
Great questions. So changes in Albany through the enacted state budget increased the city's ability to borrow, increased our debt limit. And what this means is that the city now has more capacity to borrow money and put spending plans into the capital budget. In the executive budget, most of the adds of new funding were largely for the School Construction Authority and the Department of Corrections. As far as how increasing the city's ability to take on debt will translate to individual agencies, we can't say what the administration's plans are there. They have specifically in their request to get additional funding cited the areas of the class size bill requiring more school construction, borough-based jails, which then translates to spending in the Department of Corrections. And then also looming over the city in terms of capital projects is what to do with the aging Brooklyn Queens Expressway, the BQE. For local law 97, we did see that the executive budget, the administration moved previously planned capital spending from future years to more near-term period. And so that indicates that there is some effort into meeting local law 97 compliance. The executive budget also added, I'd like to note, 36 positions at the Department of Buildings, specifically for local law 97 compliance. And this is adding on to the current 22 positions.
Thanks. And I was wondering if you can comment on what IBO saw analyzing OMB's climate budgeting document and what improvements we might suggest or think would be useful in the future.
So this was something that is brand new to New York City. We've seen it as an exercise that other countries, other cities internationally have done. And it's where a budget is analyzed in terms of, are we putting dollars towards meeting specific climate goals? So New York City, the administration analyzed their capital budget spending in alignment with the 3 areas of net zero emissions, flood resiliency, and extreme heat resiliency. And so they evaluated dollars of planned spending as an investment towards meeting that goal, an investment working opposite that goal. But then they also, in their report, had areas that are still pending ratings. So things that they didn't have enough time and capacity to rate yet. And so we don't know what category it falls into. Dollars that are planned that will have no impact on these climate goals one way or the other. And then funding, they label it special cases, but this is city funded projects that are being conducted through authorities. So largely the Economic Development Authority. And so there is insufficient information for them to rate. So those projects going through authorities just won't be rated. So one thing, this is a really exciting movement towards thinking about how we as a city spend dollars sort of as a reflection of our priorities. And in this case, a reflection of our priorities towards environmental goals. But it also it's the very first report, and there's a lot of room to get more information. There's a lot of projects that have yet to be rated. And one thing that we also noted is that the climate budgeting only looks at the 2024 through 2028 capital commitment plan and does not review the entire 10-year capital strategy. So there's sort of a back half to where the city plans to spend money that wasn't part of this. So I think for us, it is an interesting and an important step towards thinking about dollars as investments towards future goals, but there's certainly a lot of work still to be done.
Cool, thanks. I'm going to move on to arts funding questions that came in for Sarita. And there was still, some confusion as to what was restored from PEGs that were announced previously and where we sit in relation to funding from the Department of Cultural Affairs. So I know if you can give some detail on that.
Yes, and this is something, this is an area that we have been tracking over the course of the year. We published as part of our response to the preliminary budget a report on the PEG program, and cultural organizations was one of the areas that we had identified as receiving cuts from both the November and the preliminary budgets. And so I'll start first with the net change over the three plans, and then I'll go into some more details. So on net, in terms of the Cultural Development Fund for fiscal 24, it has sustained a $6.7 million cut. For the Cultural Institutions Group, the net is a $5.8 million cut for 2024. And so for 2025 and beyond, there's a $1.4 million cut to the Cultural Development Fund and a $6.6 million cut to the Cultural Institutions Group. I will note that the cuts from November still remain for both of these, for both the CDF and the SIGs. At the executive budget, there was a partial restoration to the Cultural Development Fund. So there was a restoration of the January cuts for the out years of the plan. So the current 2024 cut still remains for the CDF, and that and then for the Cultural Institutions Group, there was a restoration of the January cuts for both 2024 as well as the out years. But as I mentioned, the November plan cuts are still in place for both the Cultural Development Fund and the SIGs.
Awesome, thank you. And there's still still a little confusion as to whether the mayor restored the cuts to the cultural institution groups for fiscal year 2025.
Yes, so at exec, the mayor did restore the cuts from the preliminary budget to the Cultural Institutions Group.
I know there are a couple more. If there's any more questions on arts and culture, I know there was a couple of different versions of this question. So let me know if I didn't hit on a particular clarity that you wanted from us on this funding in the chat if you'd like. I'm just going to wait just a couple of seconds and see if anyone else wants to ask. Okay, thank you, Sarita. Next, I'm going to ask about, there was a question that came in on the impact of New York City, of funding for New York City aging. My acronyms are failing me. But Louise, I believe you were going to talk about cuts to programs for seniors.
Hi, yes. So this is a question from Gloria Kim of the Human Services Council. And so we see that PEGs from the previous two financial plans for older adult centers total 19 million in 2024. And 2 million in 2025 and 26, and over 15 million in 27 and 28. Now, the administration has said that there was underutilization, and so these PEGs were a result of that. And the Independent Budget Office is in the process of trying to understand not just the PEGs, but also the fiscal and operational consequences of reissuing contracts, solicitations for contracts. So reissuing RFPs, which seems to be part of the Department for the Aging strategy as to how to actually implement the PEGs. And so we remain concerned and in the investigation phase.
Thank you. And I wanted to recognize that there were questions about supportive housing funding, employment services for people with disabilities, and a request for details on LGBTQ plus and immigration services. And we don't always have that level of detail to look into the budget. someone correct me if I'm wrong, but it has to do with budget codes and how general budget codes might be. If they're overly general, then we can only look at sort of the overall amount of money given to a series of programs versus like specific programmatic funding. But I did want to recognize that I did see those questions. And if there are any more questions, please submit them in the chat or the Q&A. That's what I have that was pre-submitted ahead of time. But please, if there's anything that wasn't clear or that you'd want to know more about, even if it's just in the functioning of budget, more sort of broader questions, we are here to answer any confusions you might have about this budget or how New York City budgets in general.